Have you ever wondered why, even after achieving everything you wanted, you still feel like something is missing? If the meaning of life truly exists, or if it's just an illusion we create to bear the emptiness. And perhaps the most unsettling question, if everything ends with death, why live at all? Lev Tolstoy, one of the greatest writers in history, experienced this dilemma in such an intense way that it nearly consumed him. Despite fame, wealth, and a loving family, he found himself standing at the edge of an existential abyss that none of his accomplishments could fill. He wrote, "My life stopped. I could breathe, walk, eat, sleep, but there was no life in me." And it wasn't just a passing crisis. It was a torment that made him wake up each morning without finding any reason to keep living. His success did not satisfy him. Philosophy did not give him answers. Science made him feel even more insignificant. He was on the verge of absolute despair. But in his search, Tolstoy made an unexpected discovery. A truth so simple that he took time to accept it. Something that was not in books or intellectual speeches, but in the lives of those he least expected to learn from. This revelation changed his life, and it could change yours as well. Let's dive into Tolstoy's mind and understand how a man who had everything realized he actually had nothing, and how he found a new reason to live. Lev Tolstoy had everything most people dream of: fame, fortune, a loving family, and an immortal literary legacy in works like War and Peace and Anna Karenina. Intellectuals admired him, and the people read his stories with passion. His name was already etched in history, but ironically, it was precisely at the peak of his success when he was overtaken by an unbearable anguish. There was something inside him that could not be filled with applause or recognition. The success he had reached, instead of bringing him peace, only intensified the emptiness. Every morning he woke up with a sense of suffocation, as though being consumed by a recurring and terrifying thought. If everything ends with death, why does nothing I've achieved make me happy? Tolstoy compared his existence to that of a lost traveler in a dark forest, desperately running from an invisible beast. The beast was death. He knew it was always lurking, waiting for the right moment to strike. But he also realized something even more terrifying. Everything he did to escape only seemed to delay the inevitable. For many, success and the meaning of life are practically synonymous. Society teaches us that reaching great achievements, being recognized, and building a legacy are the paths to a meaningful life. But what happens when you get there and discover that the sense of emptiness persists, or worse, intensifies? That was the most distressing revelation for Tolstoy. He had followed the path that everyone considered right, only to find a great silence in the end. Nothing seemed enough. He realized that the happiness he sought always seemed to be at the next goal. A new book, a new project, a new achievement. But when he reached what he wanted, the joy was temporary, like water slipping through his fingers. This frustration was devastating, not only because he couldn't find a purpose, but also because he realized that this feeling was much more common than it seemed. He looked around and saw that many of his intellectual and artistic friends were also immersed in a similar void. People who appeared to have everything under control on the outside, but who were collapsing on the inside. It was a silent suffering disguised as success. Tolstoy began to ask himself, has life always been like this, and I've only just noticed? This doubt led him into a cycle of obsessive reflection. He could no longer focus on his writing. He no longer took pleasure in the activities he once loved, and even his family, whom he valued so much, seemed unable to alleviate his anguish. The problem was simple. Time passed, and increasingly, he felt like he was losing his life without truly living it. What if success was an illusion? What if everything he had built had no real meaning? His unease turned into despair when he realized that, no matter what he did, the final fate was the same for everyone. Death, and not just his own. His legacy, his books, his influence, everything would eventually disappear. If even the greatest civilizations in history had fallen into oblivion, why would the life of a single man have any lasting meaning? Success seemed like a broken promise. The world had told him that by achieving all of this, he would find fulfillment. But all he found was a deeper and deeper emptiness. And worst of all, now that he saw this truth, there was no way back. It was as if he had opened a door that he could never close again. The doubt began to consume him. If everything he had pursued in life was an illusion, then where should he look for meaning? Philosophy? Science? Religion? Or was the only path simply to accept that life was an absurdity, without explanation, without answers? Tolstoy embarked on a new search, but what he didn't know was that this journey would take him to an even deeper abyss before he found any trace of light. The emptiness inside Tolstoy was not something he could simply ignore. He needed answers, something that could explain, in rational terms, why life was worth living. Why should he continue to exist, knowing that everything would end in death? And in order to find those answers, he did what any great intellectual would do. He immersed himself in philosophy. Tolstoy believed that the greatest thinkers of humanity must have faced the same anguish, and that somewhere, within the pages of great philosophical works, he would find a solution. So he began his search. He read Plato, Aristotle, the Existentialists, the skeptics, the rationalists. He sought explanations in science, ethics, morality, and logic. But to his surprise, the more he read, the more desperate he felt. Philosophy, instead of offering relief, only deepened his crisis. Schopenhauer, for example, with his relentless pessimism, seemed to confirm Tolstoy's worst fears. Life was a succession of suffering without a final purpose. Kant, with his analysis of pure reason, showed that the meaning of life was not something that could be rationally proven. Nietzsche rejected any preconceived notion of purpose and saw the search for meaning as a human construct. None of this solved the problem. On the contrary, these ideas only reinforced the notion that existence was an arbitrary phenomenon, a meaningless piece in a cosmic theater. Science was even more brutal. When studying biology and physics, Tolstoy found an indifferent universe governed by cold, impersonal laws. Life, according to science, was nothing more than a combination of chemical processes and biological reactions. A cosmic accident with no intention or meaning. Death was not a transition, but simply the definitive end of everything that we once were. This realization made Tolstoy feel a deep sense of helplessness. If reason, science, and philosophy could not provide a satisfying answer to the meaning of life, then where else could he look? He began to feel like a castaway adrift in the sea, surrounded by answers that were of no use to him. The restlessness that gripped Tolstoy was not just intellectual, it also affected his physical well-being. He began to experience difficulty sleeping, neglected his diet, and distanced himself from his loved ones. At night, he would wake up with a sense of unease, overwhelmed by the thought that, with time, everything would change. His children would grow up, his grandchildren would come into the world, and eventually his name could be forgotten. All his effort, his legacy, and his existence seemed small against the immensity of time. It was then that he confronted one of the most unsettling questions of his life. If everything is transformed in the end, what meaning does it have to continue? This uncertainty tormented him, plunging him deeper into despair. In his book Confession, he mentions that he had to remove certain objects from his environment, as in moments of hopelessness, he feared that his mind would play tricks on him. More than a mere emotional dilemma, it was the result of a profound questioning of existence. If life had no absolute meaning and nothing seemed to have a definite purpose, then moving forward became a difficult challenge to face. However, amidst this internal turbulence, something within him persisted, a feeling he could not fully comprehend. Despite his doubts and anguish, he could not completely accept that the meaning of life was simply a construct of the mind. Something inside him prevented him from giving up. What was it? Was it a natural instinct of preservation? An unconscious fear of the unknown? Or maybe, after all, the meaning of life did exist, but he needed to look for it elsewhere? Tolstoy didn't know the answer, but the mere fact that this doubt still existed, that he couldn't accept death as the only possible conclusion, meant that his search was not over. He decided to look beyond philosophy, science, and intellectual pursuits. If the greatest thinkers in the world had not been able to give him an answer, maybe the solution lay elsewhere. Perhaps, just perhaps, he had been looking for meaning in the wrong places. And so, he began to focus on those who had never read Kant, Schopenhauer, or Nietzsche. Those who didn't have great wealth, fame, or recognition. Those who didn't spend hours immersed in philosophical questions, but who somehow seemed to live with a peace that Tolstoy had never felt. Tolstoy was about to discover something that would change his life forever. He began to observe those who had never read Kant, never debated Schopenhauer, and didn't worry about Nietzsche's logic. The peasants, the humble workers, the artisans, people who at first glance seemed to lead difficult lives without luxuries or great achievements. But unlike the fully embracing each moment as it came, they found meaning in the simple acts of daily life, tending to their gardens, sharing stories by the fire, watching the sunrise with quiet reverence. For them, existence was not a puzzle to be solved, but an experience to be lived. They did not measure their worth by achievements or by how they would be remembered. Instead, they measured it by the depth of their laughter, the warmth of their connections, and the peace they felt when the day came to an end. In a world obsessed with purpose and progress, they had discovered something rare, the beauty of simply being. And so, as the days turned to years, their lives became a quiet testament to the art of living. They found joy in the rhythm of the seasons, in the whispers of the wind through the trees, and in the gentle ebb and flow of time. Others who passed through their lives often marveled at their contentment. "Don't you want more?" some would ask, unable to understand how they could be so at peace without chasing after something greater. But they would only smile, their eyes reflecting a wisdom that needed no words. For they had learned what few ever do, that the search for meaning often blinds people to the fact that meaning is already here, woven into the fabric of every moment, in the way the morning light spills through the window, in the laughter of a loved one, in the simple pleasure of a warm cup of tea on a cold evening. They did not need to conquer the world or leave behind a legacy. Their legacy was in the kindness they shared, the love they nurtured, and the peace they carried within them. And when their time finally came, they left as they had lived, without regret, without unfinished dreams, only with the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived. And perhaps in the gentle hush of the wind that followed, the world whispered back its understanding. They had not just existed, but truly lived. As the echoes of knowledge fade into the vastness of the universe, we stand on the threshold of endless discovery. The being of knowledge may take its final bow, but its wisdom lingers in the hearts and minds of those who seek truth, who dare to question, who yearn to understand. This is not the end, it is a new beginning, a torch passed from the unknown to the known, from mystery to revelation. And as long as curiosity burns within us, as long as we continue to search, to learn, to dream, the being of knowledge will never truly be gone. Farewell, but never forgotten. The journey continues.